I'm Ken Paulson, the director of the Free Speech Center at Middle Tennessee State University. And today we have a remarkable guest, the author of this book, The Fight for Free Speech. And it is 10 cases that define our First Amendment freedoms. An awful lot of books out there are almost impossible to read. They get caught in the weeds, and it's really hard for the layman or the student to actually master these subjects. And Ian has done a fine job of taking contemporary issues and relating them to classic cases. So you can see that these important principles last literally for decades. And almost anything can happen today or tomorrow. You can go back to 1960 or 1943. You'll find precedents that will determine how these cases will turn out. Ian, I want to welcome you. I want to tell folks, first of all, that you are legal counsel for ABC News since 2003, also a documentary filmmaker and a media law professor at Brooklyn College. Welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Virtually.
How did you happen upon or decide to pursue this approach to your books?
Well, I think over the last 4 years, people of all political persuasions and sort of all types of people have been really clamoring for their right to speak and be heard. But most people don't have really anywhere to turn to get clear answers about what their First Amendment rights, particularly their free speech and their free press rights, really entail. And I know from you and I have talked about how for the media law class that I teach at Brooklyn College, it's for communications arts grad students, primarily people getting their MFAs or their MAs in radio or television production. And, textbooks, sort of law school type textbooks are really for lawyers and don't really work in a class that's about media law issues, but not for law students. There's a lot of books about sort of this is someone who says, this is my take on the First Amendment. But what I'm trying to do is to answer contemporary controversies that raise questions like national school walkout or Colin Kaepernick taking a knee or Nazis marching in Charlottesville. And then, as you were describing, to answer the questions raised by those issues with telling the story of the key Supreme Court case and the people who fought for their rights all the way up to the Supreme Court that provides answers. So I began sort of wanting to do, a sweep of free speech and free press law that would be useful for people interested in these issues, but who were not lawyers and who wanted to hear great stories about free speech battles and how that applies to our rights today.
So the 45 words of the First Amendment are remarkably succinct. They pack a lot of content in 45 words. But if by chance someone stopped you on the street and said, Ian, can you explain to me what the free speech clause says? Do you have a quick answer for that?
We can go to the text and say Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. But I think that really boils down to that if the free speech clause means anything, it means that we don't want the government controlling our speech. So a lot of these cases we are focusing, almost all of these cases, we are focusing directly on that issue of the government interference with speech. And one of the goals of this book is that people will often say, I have a free speech right. And they maybe do and maybe they don't. But one of the things we have to remember is how does the government play into the issue at hand? And so not only is this book supposed to help people understand what their rights are, I want to also make it clear to people when sometimes the First Amendment doesn't actually apply to the issue at hand.
So interestingly, one of the most visible free speech cases of the last 5 years anyway, was one that doesn't involve the government. But most people think it does. And I'm talking about the case you referred to, the kneeling of Mr. Kaepernick in 2016. This has been a huge story. I'm sure most people listening to this now are familiar with it. But could you recap a bit what happened and whether the First Amendment actually is involved?
Sure. And that's sort of a trick question. So I definitely think that Colin Kaepernick's taking a knee, even before the tragedy of George Floyd, was the defining sort of free speech challenge and free speech protest of our generation, of this current generation. And so when Colin Kaepernick chose to not stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, for the national anthem during his games. He was really trying to take a stand against police brutality, against the discrimination that Black people face at the hands of the police, and more systemically in our society. And he actually, what's so interesting is, he decided initially he just sat. But he actually decided to take a knee after Nate Boyer, who's also an NFL player who had been in the military, had tried to engage in a discussion with him, and Kaepernick embraced that discussion by saying that some people find sitting disrespectful, but taking a knee is a traditional gesture of respect for many people in the military. And so that was actually Kaepernick's effort to try and frame his protest in a way that would be respectful, even if that is not a requirement, but that it would be respectful to people who may disagree with his message. So, with the rise of that controversy, the question becomes, does the NFL, can the NFL restrict Kaepernick's right to protest? And the short answer there is, and so this is chapter 2 of my book, we go through it, and I had a lot of fun with actually sort of telling the Kaepernick story in detail. There's not a lot of places where it's sort of all laid out in one spot. So that's the beginning of the chapter, is sort of telling you about the how his protest evolved. And then the question is, can the NFL restrict his speech? And the answer is yes, because they are a private employer, and private employers can almost always restrict the speech of their employees. However, I also say that's not where the story ends, neither for Kaepernick nor for other people engaging in this protest. And to explain why, I tell the story of the 2 key Supreme Court cases that involved Jehovah's Witness students right before World War II and during America's involvement in World War II, who refused to pledge allegiance to the flag in their public school classrooms. And these were elementary students and middle school students who believed that it was a violation of their religious principles, that it was a form of idolatry to pledge allegiance to the flag. And the first case goes up and Justice to the Supreme Court, and Justice Frankfurter writes a decision right as the Nazis are invading France. And Justice Frankfurter says, basically, although you would think he would be more liberal in this regard, he says that during wartime, unity is more important than sort of civil liberties. But after that decision, there was a horrible wake of anti-Jehovah's Witness violence. Many historians think it's the worst example of religious discrimination, religious violence, religious motivated violence in this country's history. People were tarred and feathered. One man was castrated. Jehovah's Witnesses' religious buildings were burned. And they take their case. The Supreme Court sort of indicates that they're going to reconsider. And so then some new families come up. The Barnett sisters come up, and they refuse to pledge allegiance to the flag. And this time, Justice Jackson, in a beautiful opinion, says that there is a right not to speak, that the government can't compel us to express a message that we don't believe in. And so what does that mean for Colin Kaepernick? Well, it certainly speaks to the free speech values that this society should embrace, in my opinion, that there is a right not to speak, and that it is patriotic to express dissent, and it is not unpatriotic to engage or to refuse to engage in sort of public demonstrations of patriotism. But the other thing we need to know is that Barnett squarely does protect students who at public universities or public high schools or public elementary schools who choose to take a knee, if their administrators try to punish them for the same action that Colin Kaepernick does, because public schools are considered the government or state actors, to talk about the state actor doctrine. So public school students are directly protected by this decision that protected Jehovah's Witness students during World War II. Our students today at public universities are protected. If somebody tries to punish them for taking a knee, the Supreme Court has something to say about that. And there is a right to resist and to refuse to engage in that type of forced patriotic display.
Ian, you packed a lot of constitutional law into that, and that's one of the reasons I like your book so much. It's a relatively brisk read given the subject matter.
Thank you.
But I wanted to emphasize something for the students, for those who are watching this. These are my favorite free speech cases among them, and in part because in both cases it is children that are changing the world. You know, in the first case, Gobitis that you mentioned, you've got George and Lillian, who it appears they're not put up to this. This is something that it bothers them, that you know, their faith is that you cannot worship an idol, and here they're being told as Jehovah's Witnesses to worship this piece of cloth on the wall, and they say, no, I'm not going to do that. And then same story, the Barnett sisters, as you point out, in 1942, again, courageous little kids. I think, you know, the oldest of them all might have been 13 or 14 years old, who reached the same heartfelt conclusion. And I'd be interested in knowing, as you know well, the first case, the Supreme Court says, you know what, your freedom of religion doesn't trump your patriotism. So it's a religious decision. Yeah. The second one, they're saying, no, you know, the government can't make you say what you don't want to say. Do you think that the decision in the earlier case is still good law?
No. In my opinion, it is not. You know, I think what Justice Jackson does, what you're alluding to, is that he reframes the question, not only because I think it's the better way to perceive the case, but he also does it sort of for tactical, strategic reasons. Rather than saying somebody deserves a religious exception for doing something that everyone else is doing, Justice Jackson says, no, this is a prohibition on the government for forcing people to do something that they don't agree to. So rather than sort of trying to get permission to stop, he's saying, no, the government can't start to force you to do something that you don't believe in. And, you know, he has beautiful language about how, which I'll paraphrase, I don't say as eloquently as he, but, you know, he says, if there's any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it's that there should be nothing orthodox in politics and in our government. In other words, that there should be no only one way. If the free speech means anything, it's that there's not one way we have to believe or have to act or have to obey. And so I believe Justice Jackson's decision, you know, ends the Gobitis precedent, and really, you know, all Justice Frankfurter had, and really, I don't, tragic might be too strong, but I think it's really sad that Justice Frankfurter, who was this liberal who co-founded the ACLU and, you know, defended other anarchists and really had this, you know, was an immigrant himself who came to this country not speaking English, grew up on the Lower East Side, right where I'm speaking from right now, and you know, became the first Jewish professor at Harvard Law School. It's really disappointing that he felt sort of compelled to believe in unity over civil liberties. And I think he, I think that his only argument really to defend against Justice Jackson's decision was that this has only been 3 years and we shouldn't overturn a decision in 3 years. And I believe that is sort of for a significant precedent, that's the fastest the Supreme Court has ever abruptly reversed course. And I think it was because it was so wrongly decided in the first place, but also because the politics had changed. You know, at the beginning of the war, there was this idea like, oh, we have to all band together. But in the middle of the war, the concern was, how are we, the beacon of democracy, going to be arguing that we're fighting for freedom if we're repressing our religious minorities in a very similar way that the Nazis were repressing Jehovah's Witnesses in their own countries, not to mention the other more horrible religious persecution. So it's very much about the politics, and it's a little bit longer answer to your question, but I do believe it is no longer the Gobitis.
That's an excellent observation. It's ironic, isn't it, that people will shout down at Colin Kaepernick, or earlier the Dixie Chicks, as being un-American for exercising the most American of rights, Absolutely. Sharing your free speech with your public. I wanted to turn now to a subject that I think is probably close to home for the students who are listening and watching. Of course, these are college students and the rules are different, but it wasn't very long ago. When you were in high school at public school, your rights were determined in large part by your principal, by your teachers, and that has to do with uh, the First Amendment and government power. Um, as some of you know, there are actually some pretty clear rules, and they go back to a young woman named Mary Beth Tinker and her brother in the 60s. An inspiring story. Again, the children will lead them. Ian, you picked out that case for your book. Could you tell this really inspiring story?
Sure. So again, I begin that chapter on student speech with talking about the national school walkout, and which was another reason I wrote this book, is because I was having a discussion with my own children who at the time were ages 12 and 10, and they were interested in participating in the walkout, and they really wanted to know what their rights were, what were student speech rights. And, I realized in sort of talking with them that wisdom can be condensed, but it doesn't need to be dumbed down. And that was sort of made me rethink a sort of the way I had sort of been thinking about some of these cases, and trying to convey them in the simplest way possible, but without losing any of the fun details. So as you're saying, so what are our student speech rights? It's all back to Tinker. Mary Beth Tinker and her brother and a friend wore a black armband to protest the Vietnam War and to honor the dead on both sides, meaning Americans and Vietnamese, which is a very radical notion. This is at the relative early stages of America's involvement in the war, when the war was still overwhelmingly popular in this country, or at least Americans supported the war. So she wears this black armband to her middle school, and nothing happens at the beginning of the day. And then she gets a pink slip from Mr. Mowbray, her favorite teacher, who was her math teacher, to go up to see the principal. And the principal asked her to take off the armband. And Mary Beth Tinker has said that in a moment of blinding courage, she took it off right away. And she said she likes to tell that story because you only have to be sort of, a little bit brave to make a difference, she talks about. So she takes off the armband, but they suspend her anyway. And ultimately, so these are students in Iowa. The Iowa Civil Liberties Union takes up their cause. A very young lawyer argues their case on their behalf. It goes up to the Supreme Court. And for the first time, explicitly, the court, in a beautiful decision by Justice Fortas, says that students don't give up their rights to free speech as they pass through the schoolhouse gates. So in other words, there's this image of, as you're walking through to school, you don't have to relinquish your constitutional rights. And this was really pretty groundbreaking. No one had, no court, and certainly not the Supreme Court, had declared that there were absolute free speech rights for students until that time. The Supreme Court hadn't, other courts had. And so the test becomes sort of a forecast, a reasonable forecast of significant disruption. And what that means is that administrators can't just say that they think that there might be some problem. They have to have some reason to believe there would be a significant disruption to the classroom experience, not just that you might be momentarily distracted by looking at an armband or momentarily think about the war or some other topic. So that begins sort of student speech rights in American history as being recognized by the court. And the court has backtracked from that to a certain degree, and we can talk about those cases, but not to the extent that Tinker is overturned, and certainly not to the extent that students have to go back to sort of the pre-Tinker days of not having any recognition of their rights.
So let me give you a pop quiz. A young man pulls into the student parking lot at an American public high school, and he has a Confederate flag on his bumper.
Yeah.
Can the administration of the school tell him to take the sticker off or to leave the parking lot?
No, I would say no. It's on school grounds. There's no, sort of some people might object depending on the community. But that, I would say, unless there was further evidence of some type of, specific reason, some incident had happened a day before regarding that flag or something, even then I would try and defend his rights. But on school property, I will count the parking lot for this hypothetical as school property. You could do a little essay on that for your exam, but I believe that that a bumper sticker is like an armband, is like a pin, is like a T-shirt, and that those would all be protected without something more to believe that there would be a significant disruption.
Well, let me up the ante for you a little bit. Yeah. He decides that he likes to look at the Confederate flag so much, and he's been allowed to keep it in the parking lot. He goes in and wears a Confederate flag T-shirt and sits down next to the young man with Black Lives Matter T-shirt. This dress code at this high school allows designs on T-shirts. There's no prohibition against designed T-shirts. What's your answer now?
It's the same answer. I believe that both the Black Lives Matter T-shirt and the Confederate flag T-shirt are, a speech. One of the other things that Tinker says is that wearing something can be speech. So we sort of skipped over that important point. But a black armband, a T-shirt, a button, you don't have to speak to be protected by the free speech clause. And I think those are both equally important expressions of political and social issues, and that without more, both people should be able to wear those T-shirts during the school day.
You've aced the pop quiz, by the way.
I should hope so, but thank you.
So to clarify for the folks listening to this, Tinker doesn't apply to college students. What applies to college students? Can they do anything, say anything, wear anything they'd like?
Are you asking me, or are you asking me?
No, I'm asking you. You have the law degree.
Yeah, that's true. So I would say that college students don't have to follow Tinker, which sort of is protecting student rights, but still there's this reasonable disruption test. There is no equivalent reasonable disruption test for adults, putting a couple other asterisks there. Advocacy of imminent illegal action, putting that aside, there is no sort of equivalent student test for adults. And so college students are like full-fledged adults. They are adults. And college students have even greater speech protections than Tinker. I would say, that gets into the sort of the Cohen case that I also talk about in my book. The man who, the college age student, he wasn't in college, but the young man who wore a jacket, I will curse on this Zoom, who wore a jacket that said "fuck the draft" into a courthouse, also during the Vietnam War, and the bailiffs tried to punish him for disturbing the peace, and the court upholds his right to offend. So I would say that the college students' rights are the same as Cohen's, and even higher level of First Amendment protection, of free speech protection than.
Ian, you just guaranteed that this Zoom will never show up on ABC.
That's right. That's another chapter in my book. I talk about the right not to curse on broadcast television.
So let's talk. Let's talk now, though, about satire, and we sort of live in a golden age of satire because there's so many platforms that just want short and funny things, and there's a real market for sarcasm and satire. I am of a college generation, that saw Saturday Night Live come on, but of course there's so many outlets now. Probably important to explain to everybody what the difference is between a broadcast network and its limits and a cable channel.
Right. Well, and this is a lot of the distinctions I try and make in my book. I hope once I explain them, they make sense, and they, even if you don't agree with them, that they sort of have an intuitive understanding that people can get. This distinction makes no sense, so I'll just frame it there. But that broadcast television and broadcast radio are limited in what they can say in terms of fleeting expletives and fleeting nudity. Because of a different case. There's the sort of the satire case, and then there's George Carlin and the 7 Dirty Words case. So, which ultimately says that the FCC can regulate, if not fully censor, content on the broadcast networks. There are historical reasons for it. I don't think it makes any sense. I mean, when I was explaining to my kids when they were younger about what I did, I worked for ABC News, and I said it's a broadcast network. It's the news division of a broadcast network. And they were like, "Oh, is that like Netflix?" No, it's not like Netflix. "Oh, is that on demand?" No, it's not. Oh, it's streaming? No, no one knows what a broadcast network is anymore. It really is a historical anomaly. But there are limits to what the broadcast networks can do, as opposed to what we can do right now, as you say.
And
we can go
to
back
belabor it, broadcast is literally broadcast. It's sent over air.
Right.
And it's not connected by cable. But what complicates it then is that it's then put on cable, and most of us get our delivery that way.
Yeah.
So you point out again, I mean, you picked the First Amendment's greatest hits.
Yes.
I love the story of Hustler magazine and its tribute of sorts to Reverend Jerry Falwell. What an amazing story that is.
It's an incredible story. It's really apocalyptic. I mean, you have and this is the satire case that Ken was alluding to before. So, I begin with Trump saying, like, why can't there be some punishment of Saturday Night Live for the awful things that they're saying about me? And the reason is the Hustler versus Falwell. So for people who don't know, Jerry Falwell was a evangelical preacher who not only had a phenomenally successful television show, but was the co-founder of The Moral Majority, a very sort of the leading and sort of first major Christian right political advocacy organization. And so that's Jerry Falwell. And then we have Larry Flynt. For those of you who've seen The People versus Larry Flynt, it's a very good movie that does part of this case. And Larry Flynt was the publisher of Hustler magazine, and he had an ad in one of their magazine issues that was riffing off of, was a parody of a Campari ad. Campari is the Italian liqueur, and they had an ad campaign going at the time where different celebrities, Jill St. John, Tony Roberts, sort of actor and actress celebrities who talk about their first time. And the double entendre is that it sounds like they're talking about the first time they had sex, but they're really talking about the first time they had the drink. So Hustler puts a parody ad with a real picture of Falwell in the same format, which was sort of like a quasi-interview format of these ads, and says, what I can say, even in this class, what I'm willing to say is that the Hustler ad said that that Falwell was having sex, his first time was having sex with his mother in an outhouse, in a drunken stupor. And it gets worse. And so he does this ad. Falwell sues for emotional damages, wins a verdict, and it goes up to the Supreme Court. No one really wants to be on the side of Larry Flynt. He gets some begrudging support ultimately from media organizations. And there, of course, I talk about the very problematic aspects of both Falwell, racism, his anti-Semitism, his misogyny, and of course, Flynt, the very problematic aspects of Hustler magazine that Gloria Steinem and others, of course, talk about the violence in his magazines. But both of these flawed figures go up to the Supreme Court. And I like to say that both of them were smiling as the court started to hear their oral argument. Falwell, because he was convinced that he was doing good, and Flynt, because he felt like he was once again up to no good. And as the Supreme Court decides this case, they basically say that that this kind of parody has to be protected. And the question of whether you were trying to offend or trying to harm someone, or you had some kind of bad intent, isn't relevant, because everyone will always sort of be able to find, juries will always be able to find bad intent when you're engaging in sort of snarky or vicious parody. That will always be there to some degree. And that in order to protect political cartoons, Chief Justice Rehnquist, not exactly a free speech champion, sort of holding his nose, says that although Flint is a poor cousin of political satire and of political cartoonists, that we need to protect such cartoonists, and there's no way to draw the line. That the only way you can draw the line is based on taste, and that's not something that you should be able to litigate. So parody is essentially protected in all circumstances unless it appears that you're actually saying, conveying a fact that you intend people to believe, and then you get the same test that applies to the libel context. So in almost all circumstances, parody, Saturday Night Live, any kind of online spoof is 100% free speech protected, no matter how vicious it may be.
And of all the cases I've read and all the mean tweets I've come across, I can't remember anything as mean as "you slept with your mother in the outhouse." So that is world-class, horrible thing to say. And as you point out, the reason he didn't sue for libel instead of intentional distress, intentional infliction of emotional distress, is that no one would believe that the Reverend had sex with his mother in an outhouse. So because it was outlandish, you can't sue for defamation because no one would believe that, right?
That's right. And you know, one of the interesting, I focus on, sometimes I skip over the trials, but this is a trial, the lower court trial, which is really fascinating. And you have both Falwell talking about what it felt like to have his sainted mother, who is the closest to a saint he's ever known. And he's a teetotaler, so of course he wasn't drunk and never was drunk. So you have Falwell sort of talking about how offended he is, and then you have Flint actually trying to explain the humor and basically saying this is only funny because it's so outrageous and so ridiculous and because nobody would believe it. He's like, if the parody was about me, everyone, meaning Flint, he's like, everyone might think I had sex with my mother in a outhouse. That wouldn't be funny, and somebody might be able to sue for libel over it because they might believe it. But the whole reason we need to bring down Falwell from his sort of moral perch to our level, his lawyer said at the court, and the Supreme Court justices laughed because even bringing him down, they didn't think that Flint would ever get to be on the same level as Falwell. So that it was necessary to be ridiculous and so unbelievable, and therefore not libelous.
So if you're going to insult somebody, make it really over the top, and you're going to be safer.
The more over the top is actually, that's right. The more viciously over the top, the safer you are.
The great thing about the great postscript to this is that the two these opposites begin to respect and like each other, and they go on tour, speaking tour together. I was there for one of those. And it's like
really?
These men who were blood enemies, they just enjoyed each other's company and debating this issue in front of large audiences. It would be today like the Kanye West Taylor Swift tour. You just wouldn't imagine it ever happening, but it did.
And did they banter sort of angrily with each other, or did they seem?
They were never angry. They were, I would say, bemused by the other guy, and of course they were being paid a significant sum of money to be bemused. But it was just, it was kind of glorious, actually. It was kind of a conciliatory conversation they had.
Well, I envy that you've seen that, and I do say, I talk about how at the end of the book, and Flint just died like a month ago, but when he was alive and Falwell had passed, he wrote an obituary testimonial for the LA Times, and he said, even more shocking than the fact that I won before the Supreme Court is that ultimately Jerry Falwell and I became friends.
Yeah, well, that's a great story. Well, before we turn to questions, I want to ask you about something I would not have asked you about 20 years ago, and that's the internet.
Yeah.
I personally believe that if James Madison and the boys could see the internet, they'd be pretty excited about it, that this is a marketplace of ideas revved up like they never dreamt it could be revved up.
Yeah.
But it also, for every exciting new idea that's unleashed, there's also fake stories and conspiracy theories and all kinds of ugly things. So let me just ask you up front, is the internet, is social media, our social media good for democracy?
Oh, that's not the question I expected, and that's a much harder question. Ultimately, I do believe that social media is good for democracy. And now let me sort of explain. So I begin my book in 1919 with the sort of beginning of free speech law, with the introduction of the marketplace of ideas, and I end with talking about social media and the Supreme Court's only significant discussion of social media speech, which is a case called Packingham from 2017. So as usual, the court's a little bit behind, but we get fairly recent by the end of the book. And I talk about sort of the problems of social media as the controversy to begin the chapter. I begin with Sacha Baron Cohen, famous as the actor who plays Borat, who gave a serious speech to the Anti-Defamation League, attacking the people he calls the Silicon Six, the leaders of YouTube, Facebook, Google. For all of the hate online, particularly he was incensed about Holocaust denial and anti-Semitic hate online and neo-Nazi speech, and accuses Zuckerberg and others of not doing enough to stop it. But I also talk about Lindy West, the feminist writer who faced a sort of horrific hate mobs online when she had the temerity to suggest that comedy had a misogyny problem. And I talk about Leslie Jones from Saturday Night Live, who faced sexist and racist tweets just because she was in the Ghostbusters remake, the women-centered Ghostbusters remake. And the question is, with all of this hate, sort of with celebrities, with individuals, and then on a bigger scale, hate that can lead to violence, like in Miramar and other places. What are our speech rights? And to your question, does the internet do more harm than good? And the case, which I'll only talk about briefly, but it was involved a sex offender. And in North Carolina, there was a law that said no sex offenders could be on any social media. Not that they couldn't engage with minors or anything, they just can't be on social media, period. And Justice Kennedy, in one of his last significant decisions before retiring, he says that that free speech online, and particularly free speech on social media, is part of our free speech rights. That it is, as you were alluding to before, sort of the town crier, or the town crier on steroids. It's like speaking at a public park where everyone can hear you, but instead of a park, it's the vast world of cyberspace. So he says that absolutely has to be protected. And so there is a right to be on social media. And again, there's a right to not have the government interfere with our access to social media. However, there are so many problems on social media. Absolutely, hate and misinformation are probably the most prominent. And this is another way in which we're talking about the government sort of private company distinction becomes really crucial. Social media companies, Facebook, Twitter, what have you, are all private actors, so they don't have to follow the First Amendment. And in fact, that is why they are absolutely able to deplatform even the former president of the United States when he was the president. They can label some tweets as false or misleading. They can take ads from one political group, but not from another. And I would argue that is a good thing. That if they were restricted in the same way the government was restricted, then they would not be able to deplatform people or to prevent violence. Twitter would not be able to. Facebook, can and should do more. But this is another example where I think we need to know what the First Amendment can do as a tool. And there is a lot of problems with social media. And I certainly encourage people to advocate for change on social media. I mean, we should begin with greater transparency about what the rules are. That's been very unclear, even with Twitter. But that the First Amendment is not, I think, going to be the effective tool to make change. Maybe antitrust, maybe other regulations are the way. And also, we can make change with our dollars and with our eyeballs by not being on platforms. I have a lot of friends who have left Facebook because of their disagreements with the platform's lack of action in this regard. So this is an example, I think, where social media is ultimately, I think, a free speech good. It is really the marketplace of ideas, in cyberspace. And I don't believe that the First Amendment is the tool to fix the many problems with social media.
One of the surprising things I've heard people talk about how, well, Facebook is so big and Twitter's so big and it's part of our lives every day. It should be regulated like a utility. And no, it's a very successful business. And I always try to distill it down to, let's say you're somebody who comes up with a concept and you're saying to the public, I'm going to give you my service for free. And you just have to follow my rules. And that's actually what happens with Twitter and Facebook. And you can't blame the guy who then says, you broke the rules, you're gone. That's not inconsistent with American liberty of thought or communications. It's actually the free enterprise system at its best.
And it's very much our capitalist, this is another way in which our sort of capitalist notions dovetail with our free speech notions. Angela Merkel, criticized Twitter for deplatforming Trump and said that shouldn't be something that a private company can do. That should be something only the government can do. And that's more the European model, and that is the exact opposite of our model. As you know, so the Europeans have a very different approach, but our approach is that private companies don't have to follow the First Amendment, and therefore that they can make editorial decisions as a private company is otherwise entitled to do.
So in talking about some of these very cool cases, I mentioned earlier that some of the most fascinating cases came literally from children, but Packingham's not one of those. It falls in the category of bad life decisions. And even though you've summarized the case beautifully, would you please tell the audience what bad life decision Mr. Packingham made that led him to this bad place in American jurisprudence?
Right. Well, he was a sex offender, and he had sex with a minor. And therefore was a registered sex offender, and all that entails, and has great restrictions on his liberty in other ways. What's sort of surprising about how this case came to be is he had an alias, that knowing that there was a law that prevented him from being online, so he had an alias, and he posted about how he beat a traffic ticket in court, saying God is great. I have so much favor that I don't even have to pay this parking ticket. And a very, very hardworking police officer somehow realized that guy sounded like a sex offender that he knew, and did a search for everyone who had traffic tickets that day, then took that list of names and cross-referenced it with sex offender names in the community, and then got a search warrant to seize his computer. So it's unbelievable police work. And thousands of people in North Carolina were prosecuted under this law, I believe about 2000. So it was not just, some of these things sometimes sound like law school hypotheticals, but this, all this really happened. And it was a very sweeping law. There was no, Justice Ginsburg sort of, asked questions like, what if it just said that you couldn't, at the oral argument, what if it just said you couldn't, speak with minors on social media? And that sort of tangent didn't go anywhere, but I think it would have been a very different case if it had been a more narrowly tailored law. But it was so sweeping that they didn't have to get into those specifics.
By bad life decision, obviously, I'm not talking about the felony. I'm talking about the man who decides to brag about beating a parking ticket and then because of that gets sentenced to
yes.
multiple jail time. It's just, sometimes it's the children that lead to First Amendment law, and sometimes it's the miscreants and rogues.
Yeah, and I don't like to use the term First Amendment heroes, even though some people, I think of Mary Beth Tinker as a hero, but I tried to use the term when I'm talking about the book, free speech pioneers, because these people are all pioneers, whether or not they're for good or ill. And it's another thing that to me is very interesting, and I hope people get out of this book, is that I want people to think about these rights attached to the facts and the people involved, and then also to flip it. And that's why I sort of begin each chapter with a contemporary comparison, because I want people to think about the cases not just as they are. Sometimes, the libel case talking about the civil rights defendants, including Dr. King, but I want people to also think about those kind of circumstances, but with for example, the Nazis marching in Charlottesville. So we have all levels of reprehensible, we have all levels of sort of inspiring, and they're all sort of equally protected by the free speech clause.
It's interesting that you've also struggled with the First Amendment heroes, because some are heroes. But when people would say, well, I bet you Larry Flint and Howard Stern are your heroes. No, they are just proficient users of the First Amendment. And you have to respect people who know how to use their rights. I think it's a good time now to turn to questions.
Ian, did you come across anything that surprised you, maybe that you didn't previously know about when you were researching for your book?
Yeah, thanks for that. Well, I didn't, I think people who go to law school will know that you study the law and you study a little bit about the facts, but you don't really learn about the history of the people involved. That rarely comes up in law school. Maybe in a very good seminar you talk about it. So a lot of the details about who these people were and the sort of struggles they faced were really fascinating to me, and were things where I only know in cursory broad strokes. I would say the one person who was most fascinating to me that I knew essentially nothing about is Molly Steimer. And she is part of the case I talk about at the beginning of the book that led to the marketplace of ideas. She is one of the Abrams defendants, and Jacob Abrams is the name that people know, but they were a group of anarchists, again on the Lower East Side where I am, and Molly Steimer was one of them, and she came to this country at 16, fleeing anti-Semitic violence and pogroms in Russia, became a seamstress and a factory worker and a garment worker here on the Lower East Side, and it radicalized her. She had a very hard life. We often over-glamorize the sort of immigrant experience, and she started writing these anti-war, anti-World War I pamphlets that particularly attacked America's at the time new incursion into Russia and in her belief, trying to stop the Bolshevik revolution. And she threw out these pamphlets in all over the Lower East Side in English and in Yiddish, literally throwing them out of bathroom windows, off of rooftop windows. And unlike perhaps today, sending out emails into the void, this caused a sensation. They were arrested and jailed. She was jailed for 15 years. The men were jailed for 20. And the case goes up to the Supreme Court, and their convictions are upheld. But it's Justice Holmes, joined by his friend Justice Brandeis, who creates the marketplace of ideas metaphor in his dissent that would lead to sort of our modern understanding of free speech. But Molly Steimer, this didn't, so I always sort of go back and say, so but what did this do for the people involved? It did nothing for Molly Steimer. She stayed in jail, and through a very hard working lawyer, she gets a deal that they will deport them all if they just go away and never come back. So she initially didn't want it. There was a strike. Well, first she says, I don't want to go because you've convicted me. I'm a political prisoner and I'm going to stay here. And she had the courage of her conviction. She was not going to take the easy way out of being deported. But her other defendants wanted to go. So they leave from a dock in Brooklyn. And as she's leaving, she says, I'm paraphrasing, but she says, I hope that America will be freer in the future than it is today. And because of Molly Steimer, our country is much freer than it was in her day. And I think she is a real undersung feminist heroine. And I'm delighted. I knew nothing about her. And I'm really excited to have discovered her. I mean, I'm not the only one who's discovered her, but to discover her in my research. And there's even more great details about her in my book.
I'm completely with the program on if you don't follow the laws of the group, you don't have the protection of the group. That's kind of obvious, no matter where you are. If you're an employee of a company, that's who you're representing. And if you don't follow that, then that's not where you're going to be. So obviously free speech goes so much along with with representing ourselves in a particular way. And the only way that that's really right is if it's shown as, this is my opinion and it's not pulling anything in. But when it comes down to those who make threatening remarks or whatever, maybe not even threatening, but just very negative remarks about the government. And I'm totally just curious about this. I'm not one who wants to talk, personally in that way. But what about like those who want people who speak out against the government punished? How does that even work? I mean, because they're just speaking, they're not actually saying, or they're not actually doing anything. Does this kind of follow, sorry, I'm making this long. Does this kind of follow that we have the right to free speech, but not to what occurs to us from our free speech?
Another theme of the book, besides the sort of private government distinction, is that freedom of speech doesn't mean freedom from consequences. So we do have a right to say things, but we also, and most of the free speech pioneers in my book suffered really severe consequences, sometimes even when they won their rights. For example, Daniel Ellsberg, who leaked the Pentagon Papers, it's this huge victory that we can't have a prior restraint on the media, even for top secret documents in wartime. But a majority of that same court, explicitly said that they believed that Ellsberg could be criminally prosecuted for leaking those documents. So this goes to sort of, there are speech rights and there are sort of the rights that sort of butt up against them that are not necessarily as protected. And I generally believe that is the right sort of dichotomy here. So, but more specifically, talking about criticizing the government. So that is my chapter 1. I begin with the Women's March and Madonna saying at the 2017 Women's March that she had thought an awful lot about blowing up the White House. Now, when I wrote this 2 years ago, I had no idea that Trump's impeachment defenders were going to use that very same example as excuse for his conduct. And that's a whole nother conversation we can have, and it's in no way actually an excuse for impeachment. But the point is that the right to criticize the government that comes out of the Abrams case and Molly Steimer, but the limits of our rights in terms of advocacy of illegal action come out of the Abrams case too. Really, the defining test, something born out of Abrams, but is expressed in Brandenburg. And the test, as many of you might know, is that you can't intend to cause illegal action and imminent illegal action, and there can't be a likelihood of imminent illegal action. And that is the limit of when our speech advocating for action it gets stopped. That is sort of the limits of the First Amendment. So the easy limits are, let's remember there's no First Amendment defense to violence. There is no First Amendment defense for trespass. So the insurrection at the Capitol and the riot at the Capitol, there is absolutely no First Amendment defense to anyone who is engaged in the violence that killed people. There's absolutely no First Amendment defense to trespass. There was a right to be at that rally. And then the tougher question is whether Trump's speech itself was incitement. And once again, we can look to the Brandenburg test. So if the question is sort of when does speech go too far, incitement is really, I think, the most important way to look at the limit of when we cannot advocate for sort of imminent violence if there's both an intent and a likelihood that violence will come about from our speech.
We talk about how the government can't interfere directly with like what people say on social media, but they could make some sort of regulations to do with social media. What would that look like to like address misinformation on social media?
We could, first of all, there could be antitrust regulations. I mean, I'm not an antitrust lawyer, but that's one of those sort of leading areas. I think that people think they could, attack problems in our sort of social media hegemony. Really, only a few players. But like the way the FCC does regulate television, we could, in theory, although the FCC has no power over the internet, we could, in theory, pass laws that I think would probably pass constitutional muster, First Amendment constitutional muster, that would require, for example, social media companies to disclose their moderation policies and to sort of have disclaimers, language in connection with that, and when they update that and how they apply that needs to be public. I mean, that's just one, sort of change that we could make. And I don't think they might try and bring a free speech attack on that type of regulation, but I think it would ultimately not be successful. But that is sort of where I'm going. We are not going to be able to prevent people from accessing social media, and we are not going to be able to regulate truth. So much of saying that the government should not be involved in our speech is that ultimately people are surprised to hear that there is a sort of First Amendment right to lie. I don't talk about this in my book, but there's the Stolen Valor Act cases where Congress tried to make it a crime to lie about having a military record when you don't have it, or to lie about having military honors that you didn't earn. And ultimately, the Supreme Court says that there is a right to lie, and that the idea behind it is because who decides? Sort of we don't want the government to be the arbiter of truth. Certainly liberals over the last 4 years wouldn't have wanted the Trump administration to have been involved in being the arbiter of truth, and perhaps conservatives feel the same about the Biden administration. So I don't want to go too far and make it seem like we could, Congress could constitutionally, permissibly pass a law that would say, Black Lives Matter speech is outlawed on social media or something, or that only accurate information can be posted on social media. I think those would all have real significant constitutional problems. But I do think that there are transparency and process issues and disclosure issues would be something that could be a regulatory change that I think it's unlikely that Congress will be able to agree enough to make that happen, but I think it's constitutionally possible.
The next question I was asked to read, it's from Stokely Ellison, and they say, during my junior year of high school, we planned a walkout to protest for gun control. This was around the time of Parkland shootings.
Yeah.
Was this act of protesting right under the First Amendment, or were we not allowed to protest in this way?
Well, I'll answer it both ways. I think you were right to protest, meaning that is a perfect expression of your First Amendment right to dissent. However, walking out of school, I think, is not protected by Tinker. I don't think you need to have a reasonable, I think it is reasonable to say that people leaving their classroom would be a significant disruption in any circumstances. However, as the ACLU points out, as I talk about in my book, you would not, school administrators would not be able to punish you more severely, students more severely, for skipping school to be engaged in a protest than they would if you were skipping school to go to the mall. So if there's viewpoint discrimination, which is another theme I try and weave into the book, if there's viewpoint discrimination, or if if anti or pro gun control people were punished, but Second Amendment advocates were not punished, that would also be a problem. So you couldn't be punished more severely. It is in the spirit of free speech, but I would say you're not protected by Tinker to engage in that type of disruption during the classroom day, of course. During the school day, when you otherwise would be in class. If you're a student engaging in that kind of protest outside of class, not on a school day, I believe you firmly have that right. There's a new troubling case coming up before the court this term where they're talking about a student who on Snapchat said the F word about her coaches because she didn't make a cheerleading team. And she was outside of class. It was nonviolent. It was on a weekend. and she was suspended from the team and maybe suspended from school. And at the appellate level, the circuit said, no, this goes far beyond what's even controversial in Tinker. This is outside of the classroom. There's absolutely no way that administrators have this right. It's a clear violation of a student's First Amendment rights. And troublingly, the court is taking on this case. So usually they only take on cases when they want to, like this, when they want to make change. And that's very worrisome. I think if you want to get ready for that decision, read about Tinker in my book.
My question is a bit kind of muddled and whatnot, but is there a portion or part of hate speech that can be or is protected underneath the First Amendment? Because in just my own viewings of hate speech, like it goes wildly, from people saying obviously like pretty bad insults to like even so-and-so. And I have a definition, if I can read it out for you so we can just understand. The definition from Oxford Languages defines hate speech as abusive or threatening speech or writing that expresses prejudice against a particular group, especially on the basis of race, religion, or sexual orientation. So when does the protection end on this, or does it like encompass a certain portion of hate speech?
Well, it might be surprising for people to know that all of hate speech, by any definition, that's a good definition, but that you read, but any definition of hate speech is 100% protected by the court currently. And I want people to read this book and understand where the law is right now. That doesn't mean that we have to agree that this is where the law should be. In fact, I argue in the afterword in my book that if you're going to be engaged in sort of grassroots advocacy for speech, you need to know where the law is right now. And where the law is right now is, I begin one chapter with the Nazis marching in Charlottesville and the clear examples of hate speech that were there. I mean, among others, chanting with tiki torches, Jews will not replace us, which is very disturbing to me. I'm Jewish. And that is, and people will often say, well, there's free speech, but then there's hate speech. Free speech, hate speech is protected by the court. And I talk about the most significant recent case with that. And it involves the equally hateful Westboro Baptist Church, who, as you may know, used to protest outside of military funerals and said horrible things I'm not going to say, but they believed that one of the things I can say is that God loves dead soldiers. That's, again, one of the tamer things that they say, as abhorrent as it is. And it was their belief that God was punishing America for its over acceptance of gay rights. And so they are protesting outside of one particular, they did outside lots of funerals, but they're outside of one particular funeral. The case goes up to the Supreme Court, and Justice Roberts, who views himself as the most stalwart champion of speech on the court, I don't know if I totally agree with that, but he certainly believes it. And ultimately he says that we can't punish the speaker because we hate their message, and that these people were on public land, not physically interfering with the funeral, and had a right to express their absolutely hateful message. And we can agree with that or disagree with that, but the court is very, and certainly even the more right version of the court that we have right now, I believe is going to continue to uphold hate speech protections. And they are certainly, they're not necessarily pioneers, the Westboro Baptist Church, but they are following in a long tradition of hateful speakers who are unfortunately equally protected, along with the more heroic speakers that we discuss as well.
It's interesting, Ian, you made the statement earlier when we were talking about lies, how they're protected, because you can't have government decide what is a lie or what is true.
Yeah.
Same thing, you can't let government decide what is hateful and what is not. You can't turn that over to government. And
that is absolutely, Ken and I absolutely agree on this, and that is ultimately where I advocate, but I do want to also mention that in my book and also in people's reading, that there are very smart people who are very knowledgeable about the First Amendment who disagree with this. Critical race theorists, equity theorists like Catherine McKinnon, will say, has the speech of the Klan ever enriched the speech of Black people? Has the so-called speech of pornographers ever helped the speech of women? Has the speech of Nazis ever helped the speech of Jews? No, she says, and she has, and her and Marie Matsuda and other critical race theorists, have a very different view. And I sort of, briefly sort of talk about their views. Try to keep the book tight, so there's a lot of info about that in the footnotes. If you want to sort of find other people who know about the First Amendment but don't think we should protect hate speech, that's in there too, and they have very strong arguments. But that is not the way the court believes right now, and will not for the foreseeable future.
Well, thank you, Ian, for tackling every possible tough question we could ask you. The book is out now. In fact, relatively recently published. Great job. It's been a pleasure having you join us, and your book is a great contribution to public awareness about our most important, most fundamental freedoms. Thank you, Ian.